Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Now, we are diving into a deeply serious, honestly incredibly pivotal chapter in American history. We're going to explore the absolute limits of domestic intelligence, what actually happens when those boundaries are crossed, and how a massive state security apparatus once turned its vast resources completely inward onto its own citizens.
So what if the most massive surveillance conspiracy in U.S. history wasn't a conspiracy at all, but a verified government program? I know, that sounds exactly like the plot of some Hollywood political thriller. And look, if you haven't really heard about this history before, you might even feel a bit of natural resistance to the whole idea. It's tough to swallow that a massive, extrajudicial domestic surveillance campaign could just operate entirely in the shadows. But I want to assure you right up front, today we are absolutely not looking at conspiracy theories. We are looking exclusively at official, declassified documents from the FBI itself, along with the verified findings of the United States Senate.
Okay, let's dive into this. The program we're talking about was called COINTELPRO, which is short for Counterintelligence Program, and it was a tightly guarded secret for 15 years. And the crazy thing? Its exposure began by total, absolute accident. Picture this. It's March 8th, 1971. The entire nation is completely glued to their TVs for the fight of the century, that legendary boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Well, while everyone was distracted, a small group of anti-war activists who called themselves the Citizens Commission quietly broke into a suburban FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They literally just picked the lock, packed over 1,000 classified files into suitcases, and walked right out the front door. By mailing those files to the press, they accidentally blew the lid off the biggest domestic intelligence operation in U.S. history.
Now, when those activists finally sat down to sort through the stolen documents, what they found was a shocking disparity. I mean, you'd expect an FBI office's files to be overflowing with records of bank robberies or mobsters, right? But the files revealed that a mere 1%, just 1%, of the office's paperwork actually involved organized crime. A staggering 40% of the files were entirely dedicated to political surveillance. The Bureau's focus was heavily skewed away from actual criminal activity and laser-focused on monitoring the political beliefs of everyday American citizens.
And you might be thinking, well, maybe this was just one rogue field office. Nope. Years later, when the U.S. Senate officially investigated all this, their committee reviewed 20,480 internal Bureau documents. Just let that number sink in for a second. Over 20,000 documents. This staggering volume of paperwork proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that COINTELPRO wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a massive, highly structured, institutional operation driven from the very top.
So, who were they actually targeting? The FBI formally divided COINTELPRO into 5 distinct categories. It started back in 1956 looking at the Communist Party, expanded in '61 to the Socialist Workers' Party, and then grew to include white hate groups like the KKK in '64. But by the late 1960s, the net widened drastically to target black nationalists, which included mainstream civil rights organizers and the New Left, which swept up anti-war protesters and student groups. The really crucial takeaway here is that out of the roughly 20,000 individuals investigated solely for their political beliefs, the vast majority had zero history of violence, none. Many were quite simply exercising their First Amendment constitutional rights to organize and protest.
All right, let's look at the day-to-day bureaucracy. How did an operation of this incredible magnitude actually function without the public finding out? Well, it all came down to a very strict closed-loop system engineered by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
Now, what's really interesting about this whole process is that local field offices couldn't just go rogue and act on their own. Not at all. They had to draft these formal, highly detailed proposals and send them all the way up the chain to FBI headquarters in Washington. Hoover, along with his assistant director William C. Sullivan, would personally review and authorize these actions before local agents could execute them. Because of this intense centralization, agents put literally everything in writing, assuming it would just remain secret forever. But ironically, this meticulous bureaucratic loop created the exact paper trail that eventually proved the program's existence to the Senate.
And the approved proposals? They drew from a highly specific, verifiable playbook of 5 primary methods. And to be clear, these weren't standard law enforcement tactics used to solve crimes. They were covert techniques designed specifically to destroy organizations from the inside out. They used informants not just to passively listen, but to actively provoke violence. They waged psychological warfare to ruin reputations. They weaponized the legal system to drain activist finances, coordinated state-sponsored force with local police, and created mass public deception to alienate moderate supporters. Let me give you an example of one of the most insidious tactics on that list. It was called snitch jacketing. Imagine being a dedicated, passionate member of a political group, and suddenly, forged financial records or fake police correspondence just magically appear, making it look like you are a paid government informant. The FBI used this deliberately to breed intense paranoia. It completely destroyed internal trust, which, as we know, is the very foundation of any political movement, and it often resulted in legitimate leaders being expelled or, sadly, even attacked by their own peers.
Moving on to some documented operations in action. Let's shift from the bureaucracy to the actual reality on the ground. And I want to gently warn you here, the specific case studies we are about to look at sound incredibly extreme. But again, these are not theories. These are verified facts pulled directly from official government investigations.
You see, the FBI frequently weaponized other government agencies to achieve its goals. For example, they worked directly hand-in-hand with the IRS to establish something called the Special Service Staff. Operating completely outside standard tax procedures, the IRS compiled profiles on thousands of individuals and organizations. The FBI would literally feed lists of activists to the IRS, who then hit those dissidents with intensive, politically motivated tax audits. The goal was simple but devastating: harass them and exhaust the financial resources they desperately needed to keep their movements alive.
Perhaps the most chilling example of psychological warfare was directed at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1964, literally just days after Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, he received a blackmail package. It contained selectively edited audio recordings of his private life, accompanied by an anonymous letter. It called him a complete fraud and gave him a 34-day ultimatum, stating, "There is but one way out for you." We now know this was authored by Deputy FBI Director William C. Sullivan. Dr. King's team immediately recognized it for what it was: a blatant attempt by the federal government to force his suicide or resignation.
Agents also spent an immense amount of time just mimicking the writing styles of activists in a tactic called literary forgery. They manufactured outrage by creating completely fake media out of thin air. For instance, in St. Louis, the FBI printed and mailed an entire counterfeit underground newspaper called Blackboard, specifically designed to pit local student groups against each other. They even distributed fraudulent Black Panther coloring books filled with highly violent imagery. They sent these to white communities and moderate political leaders, specifically to turn public opinion against the group's community programs like their free breakfast initiatives.
And this brilliantly illustrates how these forgeries had tragic, real-world consequences. Out in Southern California, two groups, the Black Panther Party and the U.S. organization, were having a political dispute. The FBI decided to intentionally escalate it into violence. They forged a letter making it look like the U.S. organization was planning assassinations, literally noting in their own internal memo that they hoped it would result in a vendetta. And it worked. Tensions exploded, and on January 17, 1969, a massive shootout occurred at UCLA's Campbell Hall, leaving two Black Panther leaders dead. Unbelievably, the FBI internally celebrated this as a counterintelligence success.
But the most physically destructive action took place in Chicago, targeting a 21-year-old rising leader named Fred Hampton. The FBI recruited a teenager named William O'Neill to infiltrate the Black Panthers. O'Neill provided the FBI with a hand-drawn floor plan of Hampton's apartment. On the night of December 3, 1969, O'Neill secretly drugged Hampton's dinner with a heavy sedative. At 4:45 the very next morning, a heavily armed tactical police unit raided the apartment. Hampton was killed while completely unconscious in his bed. Independent investigations later proved that while police fired nearly 100 rounds into that apartment, only one single shot was fired by a Panther. It was, without a doubt, a tragic, state-sponsored assassination.
Now, to gather the intelligence needed for these kinds of operations, the FBI frequently bypassed the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution entirely, using what they called black bag jobs. These were entirely warrantless, entirely illegal break-ins into private homes, offices, and even churches. Between 1942 and 1966, there were over 239 documented cases of the FBI breaking into domestic organizations just to steal documents or plant hidden microphones.
And if you're wondering, did the agents actually know they were breaking the law? The answer is an absolute undeniable yes. In a 1966 memo, Assistant Director William C. Sullivan flat out wrote that the break-in technique was clearly illegal. He even noted they never sought outside authorization because, in his words, it would be impossible to obtain any legal sanction for it. They knew exactly what they were doing. They did it anyway simply because they believed the ends justified the means.
Okay, so let's talk about the exposure and the official reckoning. Because secrets of this magnitude, they rarely stay buried forever.
Following that 1971 break-in in Media, Pennsylvania, the resulting media firestorm eventually forced the United States government to do something practically unprecedented. It had to investigate itself.
In 1975, the U.S. Senate established a bipartisan committee chaired by Senator Frank Church to comprehensively investigate the intelligence community. The Church Committee really is the ultimate institutional proof of COINTELPRO's massive overreach. After reviewing absolute mountains of evidence, their final report delivered a scathing conclusion. It stated that these cases demonstrate the severe consequences of a government agency deciding to just take the law into its own hands for the supposed greater good. It was official, undeniable confirmation that the state had subverted constitutional boundaries.
And if there is still any lingering doubt in your mind about the reality of these historical events, just consider this. On May 8, 1976, sitting FBI Director Clarence J. Kelly issued an unprecedented public apology. He stated incredibly clearly, "We are truly sorry. Some of those activities were clearly wrong and quite indefensible." It was a monumental moment in American history, an active head of the FBI admitting on the public record that the agency had abused its immense power against American citizens.
So, moving into the modern era and the reforms that followed, what actually happened next? Well, the exposure of COINTELPRO completely dismantled the FBI's unchecked autonomy. It forced Congress and the Department of Justice to implement concrete solutions and really strict structural guardrails to ensure something like this could never, ever happen again.
We can see a massive structural shift when we compare the pre-reform era to the post-reform era. During COINTELPRO, investigations were totally ad hoc, often opened simply because an agent didn't like a group's political beliefs. Surveillance was completely warrantless, and informants were entirely unregulated. But after the exposure, we get the Levi Guidelines and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, in 1978. Suddenly, opening an investigation required articulable facts of violence. Wiretapping required actual judicial warrants from a special court, and informants? They finally faced strict legal regulations.
Let's move to and see how this builds into everyday practice. Attorney General Edward Levi established a strict three-tiered system to protect unpopular political views. You couldn't just jump straight to full surveillance anymore. Tier 1 allowed a preliminary look based on leads, but for a limited time. Tier 2 allowed non-intrusive surveillance, but to open a Tier 3 full investigation, the government now had to prove specific and articulable facts showing an imminent threat of violence. The bar was finally raised to actually protect the Constitution.
However, as we all know, history is rarely just a closed book. Over the decades, and particularly after the September 11th attacks, many of these investigative standards have been altered, or in some cases loosened. Today, under modern laws like FISA Section 702, the government's ability to sweep up digital communications is incredibly vast. And so, we are left with a really critical, ongoing question to ponder. As our surveillance capabilities continue to expand in this digital age, how do we ensure that the delicate, absolutely crucial balance between national security and our fundamental constitutional rights isn't lost in the shadows once again? Thank you so much for exploring this vital piece of history with me today.